So just to give everyone a bit of background, I know this was sent round. We have a mix of new delegates today, and we have a mix of people that were here last year. But the reason we are here with over 150 professionals meeting, although virtually, is because we are committed to making 16 to 19 provision in Hounslow as good as it can be. If we're very honest, in the last 5 to 10 years across the Hounslow Borough, it has not been as good as the outcomes at GCSE have been. And I think that we looked in a lot of depth as to why those reasons are. And I think there are a plethora of reasons, but we all agreed that the best way of sorting this out is to ensure that our teaching and learning at sixth form is incredibly, incredibly good. We have to ensure that at sixth form we are really focusing on teaching and learning, and that's a part of this programme. I think a lot of sixth form improvement over the last couple of years has really focused around almost pixel strategies of flight paths, interventions, better tracking of data, better use of independent study. But the idea of this programme was to get everyone together and talk about the thing that has the biggest impact, and that's in the classroom. So we really focused last year on the key pedagogies of learning and focusing on what we thought would make a really big difference for colleagues to discuss about how they work in the best area. Emma, next slide, please. So last year we introduced the develop your A-level teaching, 4 key strands to think about when planning lessons or planning a programme of study. And again, it's really important to reiterate, this was never meant to be a tick list that SLTs would come around saying, I need to see these 4 things in every single lesson. But it was more of an idea that across a period of 3 or 4 weeks, that you really should, at A-level, be thinking about these 4 things pretty regularly to ensure that students were able to get success. That was about how we help students introduce new knowledge, how we use models and scaffolds to help them access this new knowledge and be able to write more effectively, how they review material, and also, and perhaps most importantly, how we promote really good independent practice to ensure that they're able to make the most of their own time when they're not in front of us. And we had 3 excellent sessions last year. The feedback was excellent, and we've taken on the feedback to try and make sure it's even better this year. And it was all about using this sort of framework to ensure that we had really good subject-specific conversations about how we can be most effective in the classroom. Next slide, please, Emma. So that's where we've been, and today we're here online. We would obviously much more prefer to be in a hall together and have the buzz and hearing the really good conversations, but that obviously can't be possible today. So I know Emma and Cormac and myself, we've worked really quite hard to try and make sure that this is as impactful as possible, but also will allow us to have the things that the delegates said they liked the most last year, and they are the subject specific conversations. I would already like to apologise if there are any sort of glitches with the technology. We're all online novices here. We've tried to do as much training as possible. So if everyone can please just bear in mind that we are all trying our very, very best, and trying to do this across 150 people with lots and lots of different moving parts is of course quite difficult. There is a big plan moving forward for how we do the next 2 sessions as well. We're hoping that one of them might be able to be face-to-face, but increasingly as we move through winter, I think that looks unlikely. But I think the whole purpose of this session is to get 150 plus professionals talking about how we promote A-level learning, how we get our young people thinking and learning as best as we can. And a lot of that work also needs to go back into schools. These sessions, CPD, can always be excellently delivered. It can be some really high quality inputs, which I know Charlotte, Claire and John will all be today. But the real thinking and work then needs to happen back in schools and in classrooms to ensure that we see the biggest impact as we possibly can. So that's just a little introduction from me. I will tidy up at the end and just talk to everyone about how the next steps and in terms of going into your subject specific Zooms. But I would love to introduce Charlotte. So Charlotte Tibbs from Springwest, thank you very much in advance.
Thank you, Jay. Hopefully people can see me, and if you can't, then let me know. So as Jay said, I work at Springwest Academy. And one of the things that we have been having a focus on over the summer is thinking a lot about cognitive science and how we can use it to improve our teaching and learning. And one aspect of it is expert blindness, which is something we've spoken about with staff, and staff have found it quite useful, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Thanks, Emma. So the question we are addressing is, how can we avoid expert blindness when introducing new knowledge? I think at GCSE, and as Jay said, outcomes at GCSE tend to be better than at A-level. At GCSE, we know a bit more that we are the experts and our students are novices, and we understand that our students learn in a different way to how we learn. And in the diagram, you can see there, the squares representing a new piece of knowledge. And as experts, we know that when we gain a new piece of knowledge, we can understand it quite quickly, we can apply it quite quickly, we can remember it more easily, because it ties in with other knowledge that we already have. But when a novice tries to learn something new, if they don't have any other knowledge, any prior knowledge in which to pin that concept to, then it is much harder for them to learn. And as experts, it's very easy to forget the process and the steps that our students need to go through in order to gain the understanding that we want them to. And I like to think about the example of yoga, because if I asked you to sort of perform a yoga sequence now, some people, if you already know a lot about yoga, if you already know key vocabulary to do with yoga, then you might be able to perform that sequence quite easily. But if you don't know the ideas behind yoga, maybe you've just seen it every so often, it would be harder. And if you've never heard of yoga, then it's going to be a pretty impossible task for you to learn, apply, and remember a sequence. So when we're teaching, it's very easy just to think about ourselves and the teachers and the knowledge that we're dispersing, but we also need to think about our learners and the lack of knowledge and the lack of kind of cultural capital, for example, that they have, and the level that they're starting at, in order that we can break down knowledge effectively. Thanks, Emma. So I'm just going to ask everybody to have a read of this and just reflect on how it relates to your own teaching practice. It's really hard to judge, not being able to see anyone. It's very hard to judge how long it takes you to read things, but hopefully we are pretty much there. So I know some of you have probably read Daniel Willing's book about why don't students like school, and his main sort of argument is that learning is actually really tricky. Learning does not come naturally like movement does, for example, like sight does, but learning is hard. And actually, when students come to our lesson, and perhaps it's even like, you know, the 6th lesson of the day, if we think all day we've been giving them new material that they've never seen before, we've been setting them tasks that they can't do in order to bring them on, in order to help them with their learning. But all of that is quite a lot for students to handle at once. And our own expert blindness, it sort of prevents us from understanding how complex these tasks are for students. And so on the next slide, I think it summarizes quite nicely that we tend to overestimate how much we or others know and underestimate how long it will take for us or others to learn something. And I've definitely myself had situations at the end of a lesson where I've said, okay, so what have we learned? What do we know? And it's been quite flat and it looks like no one's really learned anything. But I think, you know, when I've reflected on why that is, it is probably because I have given so much information, so much new knowledge that students have become completely overwhelmed by it. So just really keep in mind that your own ability to learn new things and your own ability to remember and apply new things is a lot more advanced than that of our students. Thanks, Emma. So what can we do about this? Well, first of all, we need a diagnosis on how much our students know. Because we don't know how much our students know, we don't know how difficult it is going to be for them to gain new knowledge. So McRae suggests that we need to seek evidence to support our judgments. It's really easy to assume that students know what you've taught them. And again, that's why I think it's good to reflect on the difference between teaching and learning. And rather than thinking about what I've taught them, we're thinking about what they've learned. And let's make proper judgments about what they've learned and not make those assumptions. So at Springwest this year, throughout the whole school, from year 7 to sixth form, and we have our sixth form shared with Logic, but some of our teachers teach there, we have all been using mastery quizzes about every 3 to 4 lessons, which in the sixth form works out about once a week. And they are low stakes, so there's no stress on the student, and they are peer assessed. So they're not very time consuming for the teacher, but they allow teachers to make really clear judgments about where students are in their knowledge. And I've got an example, Emma, on the next slide. Thank you, which is a year 12 Spanish example. You can see it's just 1 page, 10 questions, but what this means is that afterwards the teacher can collect information on which questions students know, which questions they don't know, and plan accordingly for the next lesson. The other good thing about mastery quizzes is we know that retrieval is really key for students to remember things. So this is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. And what it shows is the more you retrieve information, the longer you remember it, till eventually it's there, it's really easy to access, and hopefully our students are at that point in the exam. And with Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 students, I think this is a really nice diagram to share with them, because sometimes students, if they don't remember things lesson to lesson, they feel like it's somehow stupid, or they feel like they're not doing very well. So I think it's good to be really explicit to students and say, look, everyone forgets things, and if you've only seen something once, you are likely to forget it. And that is why going over your notes, doing all these retrieval quizzes, doing all these activities which revisit things, really helps you to remember them. And then obviously it will be less need to cram things before the exam as well. Thanks, Emma. So that's thinking about how we kind of diagnose where we are with knowledge. So the next thing is, how do we introduce students to new knowledge, bearing in mind our own expert blindness? So first of all, we need to reduce the number of elements that need to be considered. As I said earlier, I think we're quite good at this at GCSE, but at A level, we suddenly, even though, you know, it's the same students we've had for GCSE, we suddenly can bombard them with quite a lot of information. And maybe we give them like a 3-page worksheet. We want them to highlight things, summarize things, talk about things. And rather than doing one of those things well, they just get completely overwhelmed and can't do anything. So really think, what is it that needs to be prioritized in order to get students where I want to get them by the end of this lesson? We need to use our prior knowledge, as I said with those mastery quizzes, like retrieve information again and again and again. Break down tasks into smaller pieces. Recycle the structures that you use, and you can also outsource some of the load on working memory by having models on the board, or by getting students to note things at each stage of the process. Thanks, Emma. A few more tips on the next slide. In the short term, We can use writing frames. I think even at A-level, writing frames are really useful, and perhaps we don't, you know, from my own experience, I perhaps haven't given enough scaffolding at the beginning. I've expected them to go from writing quite a short essay at GCSE to writing quite a big one at A-level and not really giving them anything to help them. If there is a need to speak and read for a long period of time, which there often is at A-level, then we need to build in pauses as we go. Just those kind of short time for reflection so that students have time to digest. We can use dual coding because it is useful to use speech and diagrams together. It is not useful to use speech and text together, so you might be wondering why I'm doing that. But dual coding with speech and diagrams is really useful. Direct instruction can help loads of classroom discussion, oracy, and also a nice thing to do whenever you introduce new knowledge is to get students to identify similarities and differences between the new knowledge and the knowledge they already have, so that they can apply understanding to that. If you are going to do dual coding, I learned about this the other day and I thought it was really nice. There is a free website called the Noun Project, and you can search for basically any keyword and it will come up with loads of icons. So I've just done an example there with island. And we know that it helps students to learn if you have pictures. So if you are interested in dual coding, then that's a really good website to visit. So just to kind of summarize, as experts, when we gain a new piece of knowledge, we attach it to existing facts that we have. We attach it to existing experiences. We attach it to existing examples. We don't need to go through a step-by-step process. However, novice learners, they do. Because they don't have the knowledge, like we do, to attach their new knowledge, their new concepts to, they can really easily become overloaded. So it's really important for us to think about the processes that students will need to comprehend information. And going back to what I said at the beginning, we do tend to overestimate how much they know, which is why we need to use that low stakes testing to check what they know. And finally, if you are interested in reading a bit more about cognitive science, this is one of the most useful articles I think that I've read. It's free, it's online, and it's basically Peps McRae. He has taken lots of different findings in cognitive science, and step by step he's broken down what that might look like for us in the classroom and how that can help us to understand learning. Thank you, and I'm going to pass over to Claire.
Hi, thanks. So my name is Claire and I am the Associate Assistant Head Teacher at Reach Academy in Feltham. And I'm going to build a lot on what Charlotte has just told us about expert blindness, and use a lot of the same principles as we talk about building schema. Before we start, a schema is essentially the knowledge that you have and how it is connected. So if we can move on to the next slide. As we are building student understanding, what we are doing is making ever more sophisticated schema by building more and more links between pieces of knowledge that students have. Next slide. Pupils move from novice to expert, and as they move from novice to expert, they gain more understanding, more pieces of information, and they're able to connect those pieces of information better. So this diagram is representing pieces of information using the circles and the links between them with the lines drawn to connect the circles. As we become more expert, we can use pieces of information more readily because they are constructed in a really sophisticated schema. That makes our use of knowledge more fluent and means that we can react or adapt our knowledge to different scenarios or situations. Next slide. The other thing that is useful to think about when we are considering building schema is how pupils learn. This diagram is showing us a model of Willingham's model of the learner, whereby information from the environment is placed into working memory. Working memory is where our brains process information and put it into long-term memory where it is stored. There are two paths through working memory. One uses words and the other uses visuals. So as Charlotte said earlier, it's really helpful to combine words with visuals because our brain is able to process them through our working memory in two separate pathways, and we call that process dual coding. Next slide. So I have 5 best bets to build schema in pupils, and they are listed below. Someone's asked a question about words. Words are spoken and written. That's why we tend not to speak over written words, because we're processing both pieces of information in one pathway. I'm going to pause so you can read the 5 best bets. Great, so we're going to look at each one of these in turn. Next slide, please, Emma. The first thing we want to do is activate prior knowledge. When we are giving pupils new information, we want to be actively building their schema. We want to show them where the new piece of knowledge fits with all the knowledge that they already have. How does it fit into their existing schema? That's going to have 2 advantages. Firstly, it's going to be more memorable because they've got something to relate that new knowledge to. And secondly, it's going to build those links that make their schema more expert. The idea behind learning and behind teaching is that we want to make our pupils into experts by building their schema. Next slide. By using diagrams, it's easy to draw people's attention to key things. So using that idea of dual coding, it would have been much more difficult for me to explain the principle behind dual coding without this diagram, or if I had used words instead of the diagram. There's a phrase, a picture tells 1,000 words, and I think that that really helps to understand like why dual coding is really useful. Something that you can use to take your dual coding to the next level is kind of live drawing. So a lot of these diagrams I would draw under my visualizer as I'm speaking, so I can actively direct attention to specific parts of the diagram. By doing so, I reduce the amount of the visual that you are focusing on at any one time to really focus your attention on the key thing that I want to explain at that specific point. Next slide. So this is an example of one of my diagrams that I might have drawn. I'm an A-level chemistry teacher, and this is about calculating electromotive force. What I've done here as I've produced my diagram is I've annotated the diagram with questions that I'm going to ask pupils to focus their attention on the decisions that I've made as an expert. So for example, which species is reduced? I want to ask that question because I want to check that they understand that the better oxidizing agent is the thing that is reduced. By writing and scripting questions that articulate the thought process, we are building their schema and building their likelihood to be able to use that knowledge fluently. Next slide, please. What I would do after I've presented them in the new diagram is give them a chance to recall that information really quickly. We call this lock it in at Reach. So I would get them all to cover the diagram up and then immediately recall all of that information. So you should be able to see that the top part is exactly the same as the diagram that I would have drawn under the visualizer before. So they can recall the key parts of the information. I've kept the format the same, so I'm focusing their attention on the things that I want them to remember. Underneath, I've put a second question to allow them to immediately use this information. So they're immediately retrieving to practice bringing that information from long-term memory back into working memory, and then they're having a go at a question. I intentionally do this on mini whiteboards to keep it really low stakes. Next slide, please. Okay, and then this is the final point that I had of my 5 best bets is guidance fading. As students become more expert, they are becoming more fluent at using their pieces of knowledge, and therefore they need less guidance. So our novices, even though they are in A-level, they are still novices at the thing that you're teaching them. The first thing that they need is a model. They need you to show them how what their thought process should be. And while we're modeling, it's really useful to think aloud what you are thinking as an expert, which is why it's so important to be aware of our expert blindness, because we don't want to skip steps. We want to make sure that all the steps that we do inherently, because we're experts, we make really clear to pupils that they need to do too. As they become intermediates, they need to practice using that information in the same way. And you would want to remove the guidance through their practice. So it starts with really quick recall questions in exactly the same format that you gave the model in, and it's going to slowly become more application-based as their schema begins to grow. Thanks. So I'm going to pass over to John to talk about cognitive load.
Thanks so much, Claire, and a pleasure to be talking to you also at Reach Academy as an assistant head teacher, and building on the previous two speakers, specifically that last point on guidance fading and how we can try and utilize that in the classroom. Next slide, please. So we've been thinking in this session, and I know over the last 2 years, about cognitive load theory as a bit of what we might call the standard model. It's a sort of theory that underpins everything. And it's really important to have that. It's quite frequent in teaching to just have a look at a particular strategy or just a particular, what we might call a superficial feature, copy that, and we don't see the impact that we hoped for. I think that's quite often because the sort of deeper structures, the thing that's driving it under the hood, is missing. And so it's really useful for us to spend some time thinking about that model of thinking and how information is stored, processed, retrieved, and applied by pupils. And that's what cognitive load theory tells us. But we are going to focus here for the next few minutes. I'm going to focus on some instructional strategies that are laid out that are underpinned by cognitive load theory, because we don't just want to stick with the theory, otherwise it's all retch and no vomit. So we want to be able to make sure we can use this in the classroom with our A-level students to hopefully drive great outcomes. Could you click through, please? So I'm going to discuss a guide, which is it's the SESI guide from an Australian organisation. And there are two guides here, and Emma's kindly said that she'll send these out. One is cognitive load theory set out in theory for teachers. And the second guide, which I'm going to focus on today, is cognitive load theory in practice. And it's a relatively short booklet and it includes 7 strategies. The first strategy is to tailor our lessons according to students' existing knowledge and skill. Could you click through for each of these and people can read them? So each of these strategies might be used on a particular occasion in our A-level teaching, but when would we use each strategy? Next slide, please. Well, helpfully at the start of the guide, you're given this flow chart, which directs you to the sort of strategy that's most likely to be helpful. So let's take an example. Let's begin with a concrete example. If I'm teaching A-level religious studies, one of the things that I might want to do is present the students with the ontological argument for the existence of God. It looks something like this. Can you click through each of the premises and the conclusion, please? So the first one, I'll let you read those. They're coming up rapidly, but you can read through those. So as teachers with this expert blindness, this makes perfect sense to us. This argument is clear. We can analyze it, pick it apart, defend it, critique it. but not so much for pupils, overwhelming for pupils, overwhelming their working memory for a number of reasons that have been picked out. First of all, there's some new vocabulary in there, including ontological, which is the sort of headline of the whole argument. But second of all, it's quite complex. There's a lot of complexity to do with the moving parts, how many parts there are, a bit different to complicated. Complex, how many parts there are, and there are lots of parts here. But also it has a particular structure. And so taking a moment to reflect on, well, what allows me as an expert to easily pick apart this? Well, there's a bunch of knowledge that I have underneath my what sort of presents as superficial knowledge that allows me to make sense of this. But if I look at this flow chart, if you can just click the slide, please. If I look at the flow chart, I can see it's likely to be complex. And so it's the second strategy that I'm going to probably zone in on here. And that's using lots of worked examples. So rather than just showing them this and explaining it and hoping that they get it, I'm going to use a worked example. Next slide, please. So out of those 7 strategies, that's just the one that we're going to consider today. As I say, you can peruse the others at your leisure after the meeting. Next slide, please. So, the first thing that I, as an expert, understand and that allows me to make sense of that argument is syllogistic logic. And so that's one of the parts that I'm going to have to give my pupils if they're going to understand it like I understand it. So I'm reflecting on my own schema, the sorts of things that I have in place that allow me to understand this, and I want my pupils to have that as well. And so the first thing I'm going to do is give them an understanding of syllogistic logic. That's complex as well. And so I'm going to use worked examples to help set this out for pupils in a way that they're most likely to understand it. So here's probably the classic example of syllogistic logic. All humans are mortal. John is a human. Therefore, John is mortal. And I might have a task here. Click next, please. So my task might be to write out this argument using formal logic to abstract. So what would I do in this occasion? Well, I want to set out the procedural, sometimes called procedural knowledge. I'm going to list step by step everything that I do. I do it automatically in my head. I don't need to, in my head, I don't even realize I'm doing this. But for the purposes of teaching it, I am going to lay it out step by step. So the first thing I would do, click please. The first thing I would do is I would label the subject and the predicate in the first line. I'd use different letters. So let's use P and Q. So instead of all humans are mortal, I would have all P's are Q. Then, click please. I would then, once I've done that and written out that line using the using those letters, I would say, if I was doing this with people, sorry, it's a bit difficult using this presentation when I'm not a host, but I would do that first line here. Then I would label the second line with the subject and the predicate with different letters. So I've got human, so that was P because I used P labeled here. And again, I would annotate this if I had this presentation and was using it with my pupils. And I would label that. Click please. And then write out that second line, and that's what I would do. Click one more time, please. Finally, I would, sorry, click one more time, please. And then finally, I would use those letters that I've annotated to write out the conclusion. So, could you click again, please? That would look like all P's are Q, R is a P, therefore R is a Q. This would be annotated with those letters so that pupils can really clearly see step by step what I did to slowly get towards that complex conclusion. That was my worked example. I gave an example and I worked it out as I did it. I made explicit my thought process. Click please. I'm going to, sorry, just wait that. I'm going to keep that procedure up because that is the procedure to solve syllogistic logic, or to present it formally, which is eventually what I want them to do with that ontological argument. So I'm going to keep that procedure up, and they're going to do exactly the same thing that I did. I'm going to, as Claire said, fade that guidance. So as the teaching goes on, I'm hoping to remove this scaffold so that it's automated in their head. And for them to do that, as Claire said, they need practice. They're going to have to practice it a few times. And the first practice, because they're still really novices, they've only seen it once, will be really similar. So the example I might give them is, all dogs have tails. Next, please. Poochie is a dog. Next. Therefore, Poochie has a tail. And my task is, click please, to write it out using write out the formal version, just like I did. And so they're going to go through the steps. They've already seen me do it. They're going to annotate that first line as all P's have Q's, and then they're going to analyze the next line. R is a P, therefore R has a Q. Next, please. And they will be able to solve it using that method. As Claire said, the next step there, in line with cognitive load theory, would be to slowly fade that guidance until they've automated it. And then they'll have that in their schema, that procedure that I also have, and I've transferred that over to them. Next, please. So to sum up, if the intrinsic load is high, which it often is at A level, if there's what's sometimes called high element interactivity, what you're teaching them is very abstract or has lots of parts to it, then worked examples can be a really useful way to present a procedure or a problem or a concept to pupils without overloading their working memory. Click, please. Now, we don't just want this to be a tick list, as has already been mentioned by Jay. The nature of the worked examples will vary by your subject and your topic. Don't betray the discipline just to use a particular strategy. Next, please. And the first thing we need to do is begin by considering what we want pupils to know or what we want them to be able to do. We work backwards from there. A really useful way of planning that is to literally do it yourself. Consider how you would solve the problem and try and articulate all the formal and informal knowledge that you're activating to be able to do that. As you slowly try to get that across to the pupils, give them very similar examples or maybe partially solved examples so that they can gradually begin to develop that automaticity that you want to see in them. And all of those strategies can be combined. So you might want to, for example, use some of that dual coding with worked examples. One of the things that you might want to do is strip away all of that inessential information, the flashing GIFs or the distracting Lord of the Rings references or the other things that we by whim sort of do in our lessons. And combining those strategies can have a cumulative effect. That's me finished. Thanks very much for listening.
And thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much, Charlotte. Without further ado, if that was the retch, we're now about to go into the vomit, and we're about to go into our subject breakouts, where the focus really is that we use some of this fantastic input that we've just heard and really think about how we can put that, use that, apply that in our classrooms, in our subjects. So without further ado, we're going to hang up on here. We're going to go into our emails, look at our Zoom invites from our facilitators, which you should have heard from in the previous days, and we'll now go into those subject breakouts. So a huge thank you from everybody. If you have any problems getting on, please do contact Emma or Cormac, and please do fill out your evaluations afterwards as well. So thank you very much to everyone involved, and if we can go straight into those subject breakouts, please. Thank you very much.